Good afternoon. My name's Andrew McIntyre. I'm Dean of the college here. You may have thought that the sessions this morning were pretty good. They were nothing compared to what's about to happen.
Can we leave?
Colleagues, you better back me up here. So look, one of the things about being Dean is you get to introduce lots of people. So here I'm introducing three people who not only do I think the world of in intellectual terms, but I really like. And that's an unusual combination in one person, but to get a whole panel of which you can say that. And it's my great pleasure to say that. I'm under instructions not to burn up too much time myself, and my three colleagues are under instructions not to make sure they keep on time so we can have plenty of discussion. So I'm not really going to say much to introduce them. You've got bio information on them. Steph Haggard, the one thing to say about Steph Haggard is that he represents an intellectual stream that is depressingly weak in this country. Of strong, rigorous, robust international political economy. The rest you can find out about on the web if you don't know more. What Steph's actually going to be talking about this afternoon, the title he's given himself, a little different to what appears on the schedule, is the US and the major emerging powers, a geostrategic perspective. So he's going for the big picture. Steph, you're on.
Let me start by saying that I noticed a pattern of speakers here. I think they're appealing to Tom and the board, which is to come up and tell him what he should be doing, and basically pitching what we do as what you should be doing so you can invite us back. And in my case, I think there's a logic to it because I think that international affairs, international relations, the intersection between international political economy and grand strategy is an area where the Crawford School should carve out some kind of presence for itself because so much of what it does is actually embedded in that. So what I want to do today is talk a little bit about some of the foreign policy debates that are going on in the United States and indirectly engage one of your own, namely Hugh White, whose extremely interesting book called The China Choice reaches a conclusion which I think is largely wrong. And I'll explain to some extent why. It's not because I don't think that what he says about U.S. policy is wrong, but I think the argument should be directed to Beijing, not to Washington. So let me start by saying, if you don't know this, it's sort of an interesting story. The very concept of the BRICS was actually invented by an entrepreneurial team at Goldman Sachs, led by Jim O'Neill. And he wrote a paper in 2001 that set in train these whole comparisons of the growth paths of the major economies and how they would converge around various dates, at which point the BRICS would overtake the United States or the EU or all of them combined in the OECD. And I never liked that very much because I thought there was a very diverse group of countries that didn't make much sense hanging together. But O'Neill and his colleagues were onto two things that I think are extremely important to understand that have been brought up by Ken Anderson's paper as well, which is, first of all, we're very much in a two-track growth world. And I don't think the full geostrategic implications of this have been appreciated. As far as the eye can see, you're in a situation where the core economies of Europe, Japan, and the United States are going to grow not only more slowly, but very much more slowly than the emerging markets. And the second thing is that in contrast to earlier periods of convergence, and I include both the East Asian and the European convergence actually, the post-war period in that statement, these economies are not only very much larger, but they're also very much more politically and economically homogeneous. And if you remember the history of how difficult it was for the GATT to absorb Japan in the mid-50s, let alone the debates in the 1980s over industrial strategy, what we're seeing now is much more difficult to absorb. Now, what's happened over the last several years, partly because of the financial crisis, partly because of these long-term trends, and partly because of an unpleasant turn in Chinese foreign policy, there is a really significant debate which is breaking out in the U.S. about what the geostrategic implications are of the rise, not just of China, but regionally of Brazil, obviously of Russia, and the relationship the United States is going to have with India. So what I want to do is to talk about how these economic changes influence grand strategy, and put this against a set of writings that include a very diverse group of people, from Robert Kagan, John Mearsheimer on what I would call the right, to even people like Fareed Zakaria and Hugh White, with whom I have a native sympathy in terms of his underlying prescriptions. And what I want to do is I want to talk about this in terms of the three core elements of U.S. grand strategy, because U.S. grand strategy is hard to understand, in part because it has this realist core to it about balancing offshore against authoritarian powers. This was a key feature of the Cold War, of course, it's re-emerging with respect to China. But it also has these extremely strong liberal elements, which came out of the wartime experience, in its belief in the power of international institutions to socialize the parties with which we deal, and the standard trope of commercial realism, commercial liberalism that goes back to the 19th century, that says if you trade with someone, the relations are likely to be pacific that follow. So let me start and say something about the dilemmas of balancing, first of all, and extended deterrence. These have focused, I think, narrowly on military challenges, which China in particular poses, though some of these arguments could very easily be extended to Russia. And I think that in some sense, Hugh White's book is guilty of this. Tactically, the question is whether the distance to the Western Pacific and the reliance of the United States on naval platforms to project power into the region will ultimately give way to China's ability to pursue asymmetric, anti-access, and area denial strategies. And those of you who work on these know that this AAAD concept has stimulated a very significant debate in U.S. grand strategy with respect to the air-sea battle concept and how the United States might counter those kinds of capabilities. And then under that, strategically, is this question of whether the United States has the fiscal capacity to sustain the kind of commitments it's taken on, and whether the pivot to Asia is, as a result, kind of an empty threat. So I think this debate is kind of ironic, because it seems to me that the realists have less faith in the likelihood of balances emerging in the region. One of my somewhat contrarian views of the pivot to Asia is that this is not simply an American move, but in fact is a response of Asian countries themselves to uncertainties which have been made, have arisen as a result of China's rise. And let me also say that the prospect that the United States is going to cut $1 trillion from its defense budget over the next 10 years is a fancy that you should dismiss. I mean, that's just simply not going to happen for politics that anyone knows. And there's also just the question of how much we need in Asia to do whatever we need to do. I mean, this is a reminder of how out of balance global military spending is, with the United States accounting for about 45% of it. I don't think that we need a lot more military spending, though there are systems issues about what we might need to deter. To me, the issue of extended deterrence, the military strategic issues are really pale in comparison to political ones. Because the thing I'm concerned about most is how authoritarian and semi-authoritarian governments use myths of victimization as a means of solving their own domestic legitimacy problems. And that what we're seeing in China that I think is extremely worrisome is either the leadership itself exploiting that kind of those kinds of myths, or the partial liberalization of the political system, giving rise to a commercial media and blogosphere which ends up constraining the government in ways that were completely anticipated and make it difficult for them to back away from confrontation with their neighbors to their own long-run strategic detriment. And so I think this problem of non-democratic regimes is not something that's just a normative issue. I think the U.S. is misunderstood in that regard. What's of concern is the fact that since the Cold War, end of the Cold War, while you had this sharp decline in authoritarian regimes, you had this persistence of semi-authoritarian regimes, of which Russia, I think, is a primary example, which are particularly vulnerable to the use of nationalist mythology in the conduct not of only their foreign policy, but of their domestic policy in general. So given the fact that there's this risk with balancing and extended deterrence, it's all the more important, and I think TY does have this right, that any strategy of deterring China not be mistaken for containment and include a component of trying to integrate China into the international system, both into its institutions and through trade, investment, and other cross-border exchanges. But that said, I think that the U.S. and the other Western powers face a quite significant challenge in doing that. And the challenge is not arise from the power of these countries, which again I think is too much too White's focus, but it has to do with the nature of the preferences of these countries and the extent to which they converge or don't converge with those of the United States. So I'm just going to show a few pictures here and try to go through this very, very quickly, but I was astounded by what I saw here. So this is a very simple indicator. It's a kind of proxy of the extent to which countries ally with the United States through their affinity of voting in the UN General Assembly. And there are plenty of problems with this data. It depends on what's on offer at any given period. But essentially, this is an indicator which can range from 1, where the country votes consistently with the United States, and -1, when it votes consistently against the United States in the UNGA. And this is just really interesting. So in Brazil, already prior to democratization, you had this sharp fall off in agreement with the United States and the UN. You had this little rise following the transition, and then you had this fall again during the Bush years. India, same story. The period during which you see this economic reform begin in India in 1978 is also a period when India is more at loggerheads with the United States than it had been before. This is my favorite, Russia. Obviously, during the Cold War, very low affinity with the United States. Then you have the transition. You have this increase in this moment when the parties are voting together, are seeing the world more eye to eye, and then we see this fall off during the Putin, very sharply, to levels which approximate those of the Cold War period. And of course, China, as you would expect, has always been low and remains low. But let me just point out that this is not just an issue of high politics, which is going to constrain what the United States can do with respect to non-proliferation issues and violence, like responsibility to protect issues, such as Syria, Iran, North Korea, and so forth. It also extends in ways that I don't think are fully appreciated to the difference in systems between the OECD countries and these economies. So if you look at something like this, something I find was kind of an anodyne indicator, this is a Heritage Trade and Investment Index, you see a gap between the scores of the advanced industrial states and the other BRICS, you see some upward trend. But if you look at this indicator, and every economist in the room has a responsibility to explain to the rest of the world why this is the case. Because what this shows is that the 4 BRICS have extraordinarily low ranking in terms of the ease of conducting business. I mean, by any measure of, whether it's property rights, any political economy story you tell, these countries should be growing at extremely slow rates. And what this shows is that there are alternative models of development which are on offer here, which are extraordinarily successful, but also are completely different than those of an OECD model, and there's no reason for them to change it. And so what we see, let me just, before I put that up and distract you, the point of this exercise is to say that the incorporation of these countries into international institutions faces a problem which doesn't just have to do with power, but has to do with the highly divergent nature of the preferences of countries that are entering into these institutions. And what this means is several non-mutually exclusive possibilities of how those institutions can work. Either they're gridlocked, like the WTO or like the climate change negotiations, or they become a locus of conflict because the advanced industrial states essentially try to use them to enforce the obligations that these states have. This is the pattern of WTO filings against Brazil, China, and India. You can see since its accession in this last period of the last 7 or 8 years, the U.S. is filing more and more cases against China in the WTO for the types of practices that we see as in violation of its commitment. So the organization is becoming a locus of conflict between these emerging powers, particularly China and the United States. Or, and I think this is what the United States has done with the TPP, you take your ball and go home. You essentially pick out a group of like-minded states. You withdraw from trying to operate multilaterally, and you seek to form small convergence clubs around groups of countries that basically see the world your way. But note that if you do that, you forego exactly the advantage of incorporating the Chinas of the world into the trade agreements that are supposed to moderate their behavior. And so they go off and they do the CJK. And where are we? We're in the fragmented world of the Asia-Pacific International Institution. So, perfect. That's about right. So let me close by talking finally about commercial liberalism. I think that this is something that isn't fully understood elsewhere because the United States, U.S. trade policy obviously is driven by the interests of the Fortune 500 companies. That's how trade policy is made. Endogenous tariff theory notwithstanding, the real issue is how major corporate groups define the trade policy agenda, intellectual property rights, investment, the whole list of issues that are on the U.S. trade policy agenda are basically those of complexes of firms in the entertainment industry, software, and pharmaceuticals that want to see the world be written in a particular way. But if you go back to the history of U.S. foreign policy, and particularly to FDR's maniacal free trading Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, who interestingly came from an agricultural state, who was a Southerner, the U.S. has always conceived of its commercial relations as providing a moderating and cementing influence on its relations with its trading partners. And in fact, in the last 4 or 5 years, longer really, maybe the last decade, this concept of commercial liberalism has been refashioned into a more aggressive view that by expanding trade relations with the Chinas of the world, will not just moderate their foreign policy behavior, but you'll actually force them to change themselves in unintended ways. And the debate about engagement with North Korea, with Cuba, with Iran, and with China itself in an earlier period were not just about the economic gains that we had, but about the political gains by changing the target state in a way which was going to be more conducive with American foreign policy. And what I think is happening now that is my last point here is that world economic geography is shifting. And if I had Kim Anderson's general equilibrium model, I'd love to project this forward. But I don't think this is fully grasped in Washington. You're here, you see it. But trade patterns in the world are really changing very dramatically. And notice I focus here on imports rather than exports, because imports from a political Hirschman perspective are what can provide you leverage vis-a-vis an exporting country. But in an extremely short period of time, you see that the high-income countries, which accounted about 80% of imports, are down to 70%, and that's being made up by this very dramatic increase of imports from the BRICS and the low and middle income countries, which now account for about 30% of import demand in the world economy. Now, why that's significant is not just because of Australia, which is seeing this, but also because middle-income countries are absorbing the imports of other middle-income countries and creating trade patterns in which those countries are falling outside to an increasing extent the nature of the relationships they've had with the advanced industrial system. I'll just give you this last slide and then I'll conclude. I've been doing a lot of work on North Korea. The nuclear crisis breaks in 2002. Look what happens to bilateral trade between North Korea and China during this period. Do you think we're going to be able to influence what's happening in North Korea through the use of economic instruments if the Chinese are trading with the North Koreans like this? I mean, they're in that world. They're not in our world. So let me just conclude by making 3 quick points. First, to remind you that I do have an economic bone in my body. The emergence of the BRICS for the world economy is a good thing. It's an additional piston that we need to drive overall demand. But I do think it poses a number of geostrategic challenges, the first of which is this delicate balance between balancing against Chinese and Russian behavior, while at the same time trying to incorporate them into the international economic and institutional order. But I think my main point that comes to each of these segments, so to speak, of balancing of the role of institutions as trade, is that the path of peace and order in this region is going to hinge much more on what happens in China than it is on the foreign policy choices of the United States. And it's ironic to me that Hugh White's book is called The China Choice, when this isn't really a choice about what the U.S. should be doing. The answer should be given by Beijing about how it plans to use its increased capacity with respect to either challenging the status quo or participating in the provision of international public. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thanks very much. Off to a great start. So we've had a political scientist talking about big picture issues of international conflict and cooperation. Now we have an economist talking about big picture issues of international competition and cooperation. Peter Drysdale on the G20.
They steal everything. Well, Steph's given you the bad news story, and now I'll come to the good news story about the geostrategic challenges that the world faces. There's no question, as Steph said at the end of his presentation, that many of the outcomes in the international economy, international polity, will heretofore be determined in China and in other major centres, new centres of economic power, India, Brazil and so on. And that's a critical interest in addressing what Steph said are going to be very challenging adjustments in global governance. What I'm going to talk about is how the G20 has begun to do that and how the G20 in fact represents a major and profound shift in global governance. Now the realists out there would quickly say to me, you've got to be kidding. The United States is still there, hegemonic in military and political power, and a major element in the global economy. And as Steph has emphasised, China's a big new kid on the block and will do its own thing. And India and the new members of the global governance system that have been added to global governance through the creation of the G20 process is a reflection of this interests and collection of interests in the global economy and polity. But what we do have in the creation of the G20 in two phases really, from the first post the Asian financial crisis, when the contagion of the kind that occurred around the Asian financial crisis in South and East Asia could get so out of control. And then the Leaders' Summit that was put together in 2008 when the global financial crisis hit is a new structure for coordinating the global economic policy and perhaps, as Steph hoped at the end of his presentation, some aspects of global political affairs. And that is a profound development in global governance because before that we had what was effectively an unrepresentative system insofar as we had a system of global governance beyond the institutions that dealt with various dimensions of the interaction between nation states and the coordination of economic policy that partially cover the field, such as the WTO process, the IMF process, the World Bank, and so on, those processes. What we had before the G20 process was an unrepresentative system, the G7 system, the G8 system, which essentially focused on the older established industrial powers plus Japan. And now we have a system which is more representative of the dispersion of global economic and political power to which Steph referred, and that encompasses dialogue around the common table to deal with the issues of coordinating international economic policy, however imperfectly it operates. And that is a substantial step forward. It represents a remarkable devolution of power from the established powers to new power in the management of at least international economic affairs. And most people would argue that that's the kind of devolution of power that, in fact, is historically unprecedented in terms of the cession of power from established powers, the United States, the European powers, to the new powers on the block in the global economic and political system. These countries account for 83% of global output. The G8 accounted for 42% of global output and 80% of world trade. There's a new role for the Asian economies, the Asian six here, including Australia. Japan was in there before in the G7 process. The G20 process includes Korea, China, India and Indonesia. The role of these six Asian economies is now entrenched in a system of global governance ordered around the G20 process. And it's important to remember that this was a system that was essentially initiated in North America by the Bush administration, not by the Obama administration. And so it has a legacy beyond the current administration in the United States, which will be important in terms of its credibility and sustainability politically in the US polity. What's the nature of the G20 process? Well, it's a process, first of all, as I've already said, that's selective. So it's representative, but it's not completely representative. It's not a U.S. process. It's a process that tries to represent the major economies in the world and tries to capture geographic space across the global economy in a way that hopefully over time, though still imperfectly, will reflect the interests of those economies and others outside the process across the world. That's the first aspect of it that needs noting, because I'll come back to that in a moment when talking about the weakness of the system. The second element that's worth noting is that it's grounded in its antecedent in the G20 finance ministers. That was a great advantage in its establishment because it had the base of organisational capacity that sustained the intense focus there had to be in the G20 meetings, early G20 meetings, on dealing with the global financial crisis. So it's got good institutional substructure, and that institutional substructure around the IMF process, the World Bank process and so on, has already served the G20 well. It's managed informally by a troika process straddling the post, past, current and future of the G20 meeting, and as I'll suggest later on, others have argued for strengthening that process and establishing a more institutionalised secretariat around the management of the G20, but there are pros and cons of that approach. What are the objectives? Well, the proximate objective of the G20 and its establishment, of course, is a coordination of the response to the global financial crisis. As implicitly Steph has observed, there are a lot of things out there in the world that you have to worry about. Whether you're sitting in Washington, or Tokyo, or Canberra, or Beijing. And there are a lot of those things that you can do something yourself about by purposeful national action, especially if you're a great power with military reach, however limited that is by fiscal constraint from time to time, as it has been and will be down the track, however many trillions of dollars are thrown at it in the great military power in the world. But there are many things without cooperation you can't do anything about to lift performance, economic performance, or for that matter political performance, that need collective action, coordination of policy in various ways. And certainly dealing with the global financial crisis was just one of those things. The shift in economic power has been such that shift in power has become intrinsic to the cause of the global financial crisis in some way or other. The proximate cause, of course, rests in financial malprudence in the major centre of world financial power in the United States and the mismanagement of that. But that wasn't unrelated, of course, to the imbalances that have risen across the Pacific between East Asian economies, importantly China, in the global economic system, and dealing with that certainly required coordination and cooperation, collective action in international economic policy. And the G20 was set up precisely to encompass that shift in economic power and the new system of policy coordination, recognising the strategic weight in economic power towards China, India, and the emerging economies of which Steph spoke earlier. The G20 agenda was firmly focused then on recovery, fixing the financial system, not only in the United States, and that's a national responsibility, that was a national responsibility, but the way in which that had interacted with the international financial system and caused major problems around the world and needed addressing through strengthened international financial regulation, especially through the new Basel rules and also through IMF structures and so on. And thirdly, by focusing on reducing the global imbalances that occurred between, importantly, the newly emerging economies and the established economic powers, and those global imbalances, of course, are deeply reflected in those economies themselves, as well as in their international form through the current account imbalances and so on. So this was an attempt at coordination on a grand scale. The world had not tried before since the 1920s, when significantly it failed in very different circumstances. The reform of global governance also involved dealing with the structures of the global institutions whose constitutions heavily weighted them post the Bretton Woods foundations of these institutions towards power and responsibility within the established economy, the ones that had not newly emerged alongside these economies and were underrepresented in these systems. And that's the process that's been set in train by the G20 process. The reforms of the IMF, the World Bank, are slow but underway. The G20 has grown out of the G7. The G7 exists, some still hanker after it, but the centre of activity and the centre of management of collective action on the global economy now resides with the G20 process. And there's a question of what to do about the WTO, the World Trading System, in this context, which has seen a singular failure to complete, for example, the Doha round of trade negotiations, and about which we worry in terms of going forward in its underpinning of an open international trading system. And that relates to the context of norms and rules and so on. to which Steph referred at the end of the talk. So these issues and broader economic and political issues are all being drawn into the economic agenda of the G20 process. But one question, of course, is whether or not that agenda is already too overcrowded, and I'll come back to that. What are the main issues now? The main issue still is recovery. The risk in Europe is still strong. Today we heard some good news on the bond issues to troubled economies in Europe, despite the German objection, but still Europe is risk. The United States recovery is still weak, and there's a political deadlock over the management of that recovery, the now and the after, as it were. Asia has a positive and dynamic growth trajectory, though it's weakening, and that weakening is clearly associated with its interconnection with the old markets in Europe and North America, which are weak. What can Asia bring to the G20 table? Importantly, Asia brings to the G20 table a dynamism in its trajectory of growth that is a stimulus element in the global economy, and encouraging that in a sustainable way and structuring that in a sustainable way is a major challenge for policymakers in the region as they relate responsibly to the G20 global agenda. Now, can they do it? Big question. There are a lot of challenges there. That will involve significant policy restructuring in Asia itself, certainly in China. The rhetoric is pointed in a direction which suggests that that will happen, but the action still is relatively weak. Can the G20 process, for example, hasten forward movement on policy reform that will sustain the pattern of growth in Asia and help to sustain global recovery? Another important aspect of this is the development agenda, the agenda which will help to sustain growth in the emerging economies and the lesser developed economies. And repositioning that agenda over the last 2 years through the G20 process has been an important item of interest for us and our developing partners, our emerging partners in Asia, in shaping the G20 agenda. Initially, the development agenda was narrowly focused in its development dimension upon extreme development issues that we call them in North Africa. It was a European agenda, essentially. But gradually India, Indonesia, and Korea and China, and we have worked together to elevate the development agenda so it's central to the sustainable recovery agenda of the G20 process, supporting strong growth through strong domestic expenditure in these economies and other economies, like-minded economies, to sustain long-term, to make a contribution towards sustaining long-term recovery. Infrastructure and infrastructural investment is an important element, will be an important element of successful failure in that. That relates closely to structural reform, for all sorts of opportunities for infrastructural investment in Asia. The ADB suggests that there's $8 trillion worth of infrastructure projects that are viable and important and necessary in Asia, but getting them up really importantly requires a lot of structural reform in the economies, regulatory systems and so on that will make them attractive investments and productive investments are not in place in most Asian economies, China, Indonesia and India, and that's the focus of the Indians, the Indonesians and Chinese are trying to refashion the infrastructure agenda in the G20 process as well. Asia has a lot of experience in this respect. Some of it's positive, some of it's very negative. That should all be brought to the table. Because this question of coordination and the interest in collective action at a global level is not just an interest in coordinating policy and going away and agreeing on particular policy approaches and strategies. It's a question of sharing policy experience and learning from others' policy experience and getting policy direction set right. So that's a key part of the agenda that Asia takes into the G20 process if it's to be responsible and useful to that process in fostering global recovery. That relates to the new growth models that have to be developed in Asia, which focus on domestic expenditure-driven growth rather than externally oriented growth. That's a part of this story. The challenge, of course, is also in connecting this regional agenda to the global agenda. And so far, as I said before, that pattern, that structure is incomplete. The connection between the global process and, for example, the regional process, APEC, the East Asian processes, that's incomplete. And we still have to work through structuring those things in a way that the locus of the driving force of change in policy and direction feeding into the G20 process is effectively delivered at the local, if you like, or regional level. So let me conclude by saying a few things about the future of the G20 process. We have got a powerful interest in entrenching the primacy of the G20 because of our interest in the process itself and because of the close relationship we have in the regional economy. These countries together have a close interest in entrenching the process. 5 years ago, the United States was the largest trading partner, or the second largest trading partner of every country in Asia, not only the G20 countries, every country in Asia. Now China is the largest trading partner of every country in Asia except the Philippines and Indonesia. So the structure of the global economy has changed step by step, remarkably. And that's the reality upon which we have a deep interest in entrenching the primacy of the G20 process in the global governance system. We need to secure its legitimacy and reach through developing the regional constituencies, as I said, and the relationship between it and regional architecture, as I mentioned a moment ago. We need to operationalise the mode. It's somewhat similar in APEC, these systems which rely on taking away collective policy decisions, but implementing them independently of supranational authority, naturally weaken that dimension, and strengthening them in that dimension is an important interest. We have to think about how to relate the governance process in the G20 to the Troika process, to continuity in the development of the agenda, and consistency in the development of the agenda. And we have to prioritise the agenda in a way that doesn't encourage the Christmas tree approach that tended to emerge in the Seoul meeting, for example, where everybody puts everything on the agenda that they thought might be important, instead of getting the central issues fully on target. We have to get the politics right, and that's where Seth left us. We have to get the policy things right in two dimensions. We have to get it right in the way in which the G20 works, because within the G20, there's an automatic tendency by tradition and history for the old established bloc to bring their set positions to the agenda. The Europeans naturally do this. And that's a disaster from the viewpoint of effective interaction at the leaders level to make the G20 process work. So avoiding blockism, getting independence of dialogue among the leaders, and then feeding that down to the operational level, the second tier of the G20 process, finance ministers, officials, and institutions, getting that right is important. But more importantly, fundamentally, we have to get the politics right in dealing with the big issues that Steph identified at the end of the process. Because we're in a world here now which faces not only a challenge to the existing rules, but the challenge of building rules where there are no rules at the moment. No consistent global rules at the moment at all. There are no consistent global rules at the moment on foreign investment, for example. There are no consistent rules, global rules at the moment on financial, prudential regulation. They're being developed. So all these things are up for grabs, and the G20 offers at least a chance of dealing with some of these.
Thank you. Our third speaker is Professor Veronica Taylor. Veronica's Director of School of Regulation, Justice and Diplomacy, one of Crawford's sister schools here in the college. We've heard from a political scientist. We've heard from an economist. Now we've got a lawyer. Veronica's a particularly interesting lawyer. Along with having a background in commercial law, she's doing all sorts of interesting things these days, including extensive work on failing states. And her remarks this afternoon are focusing on justice reform around Asia and doing it better by design. Veronica.
Thanks so much, Andrew, and thank you also to Tom Compass for the invitation to speak today. It's a privilege to be on this panel. It's the first opportunity that I've had to speak publicly as an ANU Public Policy Fellow And so I wanted to just take a moment to acknowledge a debt to Peter Drysdale. Whatever I know about scholarship that is used for the public good, I learned at the feet of the master. So thank you, Peter. And the fact that you've eaten into my presentation time is completely forgiven. So Peter talked about getting it right. Let's look at an applied example of an attempt to project Western and Australian policy outwards and the challenge of doing it better. We met a little while ago with an important advisor to the Burmese government, and he told our closed roundtable meeting with some excitement that the IMF was going to help Myanmar establish a stock exchange. There's nothing wrong with having a stock exchange, but that kind of helpful intervention is fairly emblematic of the last 20 years of legal and justice reform attempted by donors on transition economies and more recently in fragile and conflict-affected states. And it's an orthodox prescription that's heavily influenced by new institutional economics. First, we put in place the legislation, companies and security law, property law. Then we established new regulatory institutions, including a stock exchange. Then we refurbished legal institutions like the courts. Then we moved to enforcement, penalties, police, prosecutors, prisons. And if we're in a conflict setting, we pay attention to strengthening security and working on areas like anti-narcotics. The question that's being asked very insistently now in rule of law policy circles is whether those kinds of interventions are the right kinds of reform. They might be necessary, but are they sufficient? They're attractive, they're relatively easy. You can Xerox law reform quite readily these days. But increasingly the evidence is that they don't work particularly well to effect behavioural change, and they don't deliver on the equity promise of law. That is, the delivery of justice rather than simply the mechanisms of law or the kinds of packages of rules that creating a marketised economy might require. Well, why should we care about that slippage? One of the reasons that we care in Australia is that we have a regional commitment to delivering a larger aid budget than ever before. We're doing that in an environment where we are engaging increasingly with fragile and conflict-affected states. Law and justice as a subset of governance within that aid policy is doing a lot of work, both in development but also in defence and security policy spaces. And what that has led to is the search for some kind of crisp rule of law rationale, a soundbite that taxpayers can understand, a takeaway that will justify the increased expenditure and activity. And with that comes a demand for very quick and quantifiable results. But at the same time, we, I would argue, have some pretty significant policy blind spots. One is that over the past 20 years, we have tilted the entire rule of law promotion enterprise towards formal institutions and state justice institutions. How many millions of dollars have we spent on the Supreme Court in Indonesia? How many more on the Supreme Court in Afghanistan in a conflict-affected setting? Again, courts per se are not bad institutions to have, but there's a real question about what function they perform when the majority of social disputes are being resolved in other forums. We have persistently under-resourced the informal authority of churches, of customary law, of peace builders, particularly in pluralist settings where the state itself is weak or its footprint is very narrow. There's a predominantly secular bias in most Western aid programming for rule of law. We tend to pay a lot of lip service to human rights and have enormous difficulty engaging with Islam, even although Islam and Islamic tenets of ethics and law are the predominant lens through which many elites and ordinary people understand their life world. In short, there's too much rule of law and not enough justice being distributed. It partly comes down to the disciplinary dominance of economics, thank you, Peter, and also law. And I would argue that this is work that is far too important to be left to lawyers. We also have the enormous pressure of what I call metrics myopia. There are now 34 different sets of indicators for measuring perceptions of rule of law around the world. But what those indicators do, and the doing business indicators that Steph just showed us are a prime example of this, is to reinforce the formal aspects of the system and present them as being inordinately important, and completely underreport the true nature of the pluralist justice systems in most of the places that we're working. The final policy blind spot is that we think of this as public policy, where in fact the enterprise is highly privatised. We have outsourced a lot of this work with all of the attendant risks of oversight and managing private actors whose primary goal is profit rather than any of the other multiple policy goals that we might have as a public matter. There are some encouraging signs. It looks like we're now seriously engaging with a paradigm shift. And one of those signs is the World Bank's World Development Report from last year, focused on conflict, security and development. And I've just set out here the hypothesis that underpins that report. This is largely influenced by the work of the Justice for the Poor group within the bank. They have a very different worldview and mode of operation to other parts of the bank. They're funded to a significant degree by AusAid, and in turn the work done in this space has influenced AusAid's thinking about how to program justice, particularly in fragile and conflict-affected settings. The challenges that are raised in that report are many, but let's just focus on a few. One is the need for more evidence-based policy in the delivery of legal reform and justice worldwide. You would think that we already do this, but what in fact we do is a lot of evaluation. Here's the project, here are the activities, were the activities delivered? Yes, they were. How many courts have we built? How many judges have we trained? What we don't do is turn a really rigorous research gaze on both the agencies engaging in this work and the programs and the projects themselves. The second thing that the report highlights implicitly is the need to dial back on the rule of law promise. It is inconceivable that the countries in which we're currently working will achieve the kind of hyper-modern legal systems of the donor states that are presenting the interventions. Partly that's due to capability traps, the idea that if you create an institution and give it the same name as it has in a donor state, it'll behave in the same way. There's abundant evidence to show that that's not the case. A second issue is that we, for political reasons largely, are very much wedded to delivering assistance from the donor state directly, where in fact it should really come from a third party. It's much more helpful to somewhere like Afghanistan to receive advice from Malaysia, from Indonesia, from India, than it is to try and mimic the justice institutions of the United States or of Australia. We need to do a whole lot more about harnessing social science and humanities knowledge in this space. And that leads us to an assessment of our own capabilities, tying in, I think, quite neatly with some of the work that's been done in relation to the Asian Century White Paper here in Australia. Are we really up for the job? Do we really have the deep knowledge of our region that would allow us to do the kinds of early interventions that the World Bank report suggests are important? And finally, there's a need to join up domestic policy and development knowledge. Let me close with a couple of innovative examples of how those challenges are being tested in practical projects. This is a project that I designed and led in China. It's the first time that experimental design has been used for a rule of law project. So what we did was deliver legal aid to some of the poorest communities in China, but at the same time did some rigorous empirical work to see whether the effects of the project were to actually change attitudes and behaviours. And we were able, through the randomised control trial, to show fairly effectively that yes, indeed, you can both make legal aid better known to the population and give them pathways on which to act and access those new legal services. It's striking that this is the first time that this has been tried in a rule of law project, given the hundreds of millions of dollars that have been spent worldwide in this sector. The second project that we're engaged in at the moment is called Professionalizing Rule of Law. So we have these new standing capacities in Australia, the US and internationally amongst civilian development practitioners, lawyers, police and military to deploy to conflict zones to start rebuilding legal systems. And the question we're asking here is, what do these individual actors in the interventions think that they're doing, and on the basis of what knowledge? So this is another way of analysing Australia and regional experience in the Solomons and also in places such as Timor-Leste. And I would add that the actors are a little less glamorous in real life than they are in the shot here. The reason I chose this shot is that one episode of this series was actually devoted to tracking the international deployment group within the Australian Federal Police and looking at what happened when they tried to mediate the kind of group violence that broke out following a football match. We don't have much mob violence here in the ACT. So what does it mean when you're deploying as a police officer to a very unfamiliar cultural and political location and engaged in a different kind of work? The third example and the final example is the Microjustice Initiative coming out of the Netherlands. And what a group of colleagues here are trying to do is link domestic access to justice with international sites. It comes out of a realisation, as Kerry Rittich, a very acclaimed labour law scholar, has put it, we're all developing countries now. What she means is that access to justice is now beyond the reach of the middle class in all developed economies. No one is accessing justice except the very rich. So this is not exclusively a problem of economic development. Labour rights are being hollowed out in many OECD economies. Access to justice is difficult. We've made a very poor we've had a very poor record on really addressing issues of Indigenous rights. So the Microjustice Initiative is an attempt to do things like make divorce mediation available online or via email, and to do that in the Netherlands, in Bulgaria, in Afghanistan, and in a variety of other international sites, and see whether there is anything that's intrinsically different or difficult about migrating knowledge from developed economy locations to developing or conflict-affected sites. So I'm optimistic. There's much cause to be hopeful. Australia is particularly well positioned, but if we thought that doing justice reform was difficult in the orthodox paradigm, we should really understand that it's going to become significantly more difficult in the new environment in which we find ourselves. Thanks.